Good morning and welcome. We're back again with message number 2 from a series that we started last time together, a series on the book of Habakkuk, A Strong Faith for Confusing Times. And last time, as we looked at the first 11 verses of Habakkuk chapter 1, we noted that Habakkuk has a major message from a minor prophet. And it's an important message for Habakkuk's time, but also for our day as well. You know, back in about 605 BC, the king of Judah, uh, Josiah, died. And after he died, Judah had turned from God. They had turned to their own way of living. They didn't need God, they felt, anymore. Habakkuk looks at what's going on around him as he arrives on the scene as a prophet of God. He sees what's happening, the way the people are living, and basically he says to God, "Why do you allow this to continue? Why don't you do something about this?" He says to God, he says, "How long must I call for help and you don't listen?" It was Habakkuk's unanswered prayer. He was praying to God to bring the people back to him, to bring the people back to the way that they should be and the way that they should be living. And so he says, "How long are you going to uh, continue to allow this to happen?" And then he says, "Why do you make me look at injustice? Why do you tolerate wrongdoing?" There's uncontrolled perversity going on all around him. And then he's frustrated by his unanswered prayer. He's been praying to God to change the nation of Judah, and God comes back to him and he says to Habakkuk, "Look to the nations and watch. Be utterly amazed, for I'm going to do something that you won't believe, even if I told you." What God is going to do is he's going to use the mighty Babylonians, the Chaldeans, to bring God's judgment upon the nation of Judah. The Babylonians were a nasty people, a very powerful nation. They could just walk in anywhere they wanted and conquer people and claim nations and fortified cities or whatever they would like. They just went and did whatever they liked. They were the bullies on the block. And God's going to use these nasty people, these bullies, to do his work for him. Habakkuk doesn't understand that, doesn't understand how God can do that. But he did. He was going to raise up the Chaldeans or the Babylonians to do his work. We finished that first message with just three things that we can take from those first 11 verses. First of all, we only see part of the picture as far as God is concerned. We don't see all that God is doing. We don't understand it, and we don't understand sometimes the way God works in our lives or in the world around us. We need to recognize that. Secondly, God is not limited to what we think he can do. I'm sure Habakkuk was thinking that as an answer to his prayer, God would send another godly king. But that's not what happened. God sent the nasty Babylonians to bring Judah back to him. So God's not limited to what we think he can do. And thirdly, we need a big God. We have a big God. We need to recognize just how big he is. Well, we're going to pick it up at verse 12 of chapter 1 in the book of Habakkuk, and we'll take it through to verse 4 of chapter 2. You know, what do you do when you've prayed to God and you didn't get the answer you received? When, we've all been there, I believe. Most of us have been there many times because that's the way life is. You don't get everything you dream of all the time. You make your plans and you have your dreams and you sincerely seek to do God's will in your life. You pray, and when the answer comes, it's not what you wanted. What do you do? We don't talk about that very often, but we really should. Live long enough, and you'll discover that God's plans and your plans are often not the same. We all know that we should pray, "Your will be done." And most of us pray that way, but it still jolts the spirit when we discover that God has a completely different plan in mind than what we had in mind. That's Habakkuk. That's this little book that we're taking 4 sermons to look at this time. He prayed for God to do something about the state that Judah finds itself in. He doesn't like the answer he receives. First, he thought God was ignoring Judah's sin. Then he thought God would never use the Babylonians to judge Judah. But he was wrong on both counts. What do you do when God doesn't live up to your expectations? When the Lord's answer isn't what you were looking for, isn't what you wanted? Habakkuk was troubled by something that troubles all of us. He couldn't reconcile his view of God with the injustice that he saw all around him. Several years ago, George Barna asked people this question in a poll. He said, "If you could ask God one question and know that you would receive an answer, what would you ask of God?" By far, the number one question that people would ask of God was, why is there pain and suffering in the world? That makes sense because we see suffering every day. And we wonder where it comes from and why God would allow it. C.S. Lewis remarked that the problem of suffering is atheism's greatest weapon against the Christian faith. Why did the tornado land here on my house and not over there on my neighbor's? Why would God allow a child to be born with a disability? The list of questions is really endless. In the first message, in this series, we talked a lot about the world's situation, both in Habakkuk's day and in our own day today. That was necessary to set up this series called Strong Faith for Confusing Times. And in this message, we're going to move to a little bit deeper level. Because at some point, we've got to deal with God. When we read this little book of Habakkuk, perhaps the most striking thing is the change that takes place inside Habakkuk, the change that takes place in his heart. In 3 chapters, he moves from faith to fear, he moves from burdens to blessings, he moves from perplexity to praise. He moves from confusion to confidence, and he moves from worry to worship. And it all boils down to this one fact. God says, the Babylonians are coming, Habakkuk. You can't stop them. When they reach Jerusalem, they're going to conquer it, and eventually they're going to destroy it. And I'm using them to judge Judah for her sins. When Habakkuk heard what God was going to do, he strongly objected to God. God, how can you do this? That's the key to this book. This is a dialogue between a frustrated man of faith and a God whose ways we can't understand. We could frame this book this way. The issue is not Judah and her sin. The issue is not Babylon and her evil ways. The issue is not Habakkuk's doubts. The issue is God. All our questions lead back to God because he is the one with whom we have to deal. And the smaller issues lead us back to the one who sits on the throne of the universe. All these smaller issues lead us back to him. In the latter part of the book of Habakkuk, or the latter part of chapter 1 in Habakkuk, the prophet has three questions for God. He's asking these questions, and he will make a decision after he asks these questions that shapes the rest of the book, shapes everything else that happens in this book. Question number 1, Habakkuk asks God, "Who are you?" Verse 12 says, "O Lord, are you not from everlasting? My God, my Holy One, we will not die. O Lord, you have appointed them to execute judgment. O Rock, you have ordained them to punish." What do you do when God doesn't make sense? Either you walk away from your faith or you remind yourself who God is. When faced with the news that the hated Babylonians would soon invade Judah and nothing was going to stop them, Habakkuk goes back to what theologians call the first principles, or basic principles. As Habakkuk tries to get his mind around the shocking truth that God is about to use Babylon to judge Judah, he goes back to what he knows is true about God. This is a vital first step for all of us when we find ourselves in this situation. The question is not, do I believe in God? The question is, what sort of God do I believe in? That's a key question that we all have to deal with and we all have to answer. What sort of God do I believe in? As I look at the world around me, many things remain mysterious and unanswerable. But if there's no God, and if he's not a good God, then nothing at all makes sense. Time and time again, when faced with mysteries that I cannot explain, I have to go back to the basics. What do I know? What am I sure of? Well, I know God is good. I know he is holy. I know he is just. God knows all things. He is love. He doesn't make mistakes. I know that the Bible is true. I know that Jesus Christ is the Son of God. I know that Jesus died on the cross and rose from the dead. He ascended into heaven, and someday he's going to return to this earth. I know that the Holy Spirit is real. I'm sealed with his Spirit. God is always with me. I know that. God works all things together for my good and his glory. And I know that God will complete his work in me. Just reminding myself of those basic truths brings faith to my heart. That's what I mean by going back to the first principles. And that's exactly what Habakkuk is doing in verse 12. Despite his confusion, he's giving a testimony as to his own faith in God. He's saying, this is what I know. This is what I'm sure of. And that leads us to the second question. He asked of God, he asked, who are you? Then he asked, how can you do that? When I look around me and see what's going to happen, how can a loving God do that? He says in verse 13, your eyes are too pure to look on evil. You cannot tolerate wrong. Why then do you tolerate the treacherous? Why are you silent while the wicked swallow up those more righteous than themselves? This is where we reach the heart of the problem. We all understand that there are moral inequities in this world. The other day I had a conversation with a friend about this very point. Uh, he said, some people seem to have it easy while others constantly suffer. I don't see any way to deny that observation. That's true. While we commonly say that into each life a little rain must fall, it seems that some people get a little sprinkle of rain and others are constantly dealing with a torrential downpour of trouble. How do you explain that? Habakkuk's particular problem stemmed from seeing what was seemed to be in him a conflict in God. If God cannot tolerate wrongdoing, that's true, then how can he use the Babylonians to judge Judah? Also a good point. Babylon's sins were far greater than the sins of Judah. Isn't that a bit of a contradiction? Well, the answer is no. There's no contradictions with the Almighty. But it is true that he does things that seem to us to be inconsistent. The key here is the little phrase, seems to us. God's ways will not always make sense to us, not even when they're viewed through the eyes of faith. Perhaps a better way to put it would be that in the short run, with all of life for all of us, God's ways will sometimes not make sense. We simply don't know why things happen the way they do. Sometimes we figure it out a little later. Sometimes we'll not get an answer till we get to heaven. Every thoughtful person wrestles with this point, wrestles with this question at some point. Eventually, we're forced back to the first law of the spiritual life. He is God, and we're not. God is sovereign, and we are not. Every mistake we make comes because we forget that fact. It's good for all of us to remember Psalm 115, verse 3, where the psalmist says, "Oh God, or our God is in heaven. He does whatever he pleases." Whenever I read that verse, I want to say, any more questions? Our God is in heaven. He does whatever he pleases. At this point, God has not yet answered Habakkuk's question. That's going to come in the next chapter. For the moment, let me simply note that any answer must go back to the truth that God is God and we are not. And until we grasp that fact, we continually struggle with the Lord. We continually struggle with the question, how can God do this? Question number 3 Habakkuk has is a question we all ask as well. How long is this going to last? When are you going to put a stop to it? Verse 17, we read there, is he to keep on emptying his net, destroying nations without mercy? That's Habakkuk talking there, saying to God, is he to keep on emptying his net, destroying nations without mercy? The he there in this verse refers to the whole Babylonian army personified in King Nebuchadnezzar as one person. He keeps on conquering one nation after another, and no one can stop him. If he sees a city, he takes it. If he wants another, nobody can stop him. If he sees a city, he just moves in and conquers it. If he captures you, he'll probably kill you. And guess who he's coming for? He's coming for Judah. In the face of this crushing evil, Habakkuk wonders, when is this going to end? Will no one stop Babylon? Will this reign of terror go on forever? Who is going to stop them? And this touches the deepest question we have when life crumbles in around us. How long will it last? Most people can stand up under trouble if they know that that trouble eventually is going to come to an end. But if it never ends, man, how do we survive? So there you have Habakkuk's three questions. Who are you, Lord? To which Habakkuk supplies his own answer. He goes back to the basic principles of what he believes. Who are you? How can you do this? Habakkuk doesn't get an answer to that question. How long is this going to last? Again, there's no answer given. These are all honest questions, the kind that we ask in times of trouble. We should note that Habakkuk is an utterly honest man who, when he has doubts, does not hesitate to come to the Lord and tell the Lord all about it. He doesn't cover up his doubts. He doesn't have pious sayings, nor does he rush to give glib answers. He just comes to the Lord and he says, how can this be? He answers the only question that he can answer. And then he waits on God to answer the other two. He's confident in God, but confused by what God is doing in the world. He's a believing man with serious questions that he can't answer. He doesn't have the answers to them. Well, what now? Habakkuk chapter 2, verse 1 tells us what he decided to do. He says, I will stand at my watch and station myself on the ramparts. Some translations use the phrase watchtower or guard post. I will station myself on the watchtower or on the guard post. It describes some sort of a structure, some sort of a tower that the prophet has built, and there alone he would watch and wait for God's answer to come. Habakkuk did not know how the Lord was going to answer or how long he would have to wait for an answer. He just knows that having said all that was on his heart, now it's time to wait on the Lord. Remember, he doesn't understand how God can use the wicked Babylonians to judge Judah for their sins. It still doesn't make sense to him. We don't know how long he waited, only that at length God did answer him. J. Sidlow Baxter offers this observation. He says, people say that God does not speak to men as he did long ago. The truer statement is that men do not listen today as they did long ago. At some point, you have to stop talking about your problems. But no one wants to do that. We want to talk. We want to complain. We need to talk. And talking is beneficial. We all need friends who will listen to us in our agony. But some Christians can't get better because they just won't stop talking. In today's language, it might come out like this. No, I'm going to tell Facebook all my problems. I'm going to write them all out on Facebook. That's not necessarily a good idea. And as we come to the end of this message, we've already reached the turning point in this little book. Having laid his complaints before the Lord, Habakkuk now waits for an answer. While he's honest about his complaints, he's also wise enough to take them to the Lord and just leave them there. That leads me to an important point. Our deepest problems are not psychological or physiological. They're certainly not political. Our deepest problems are always theological. Can God be trusted? What kind of God do we believe in? As I was pondering that question, two sentences came to me. He's not the God we think he is. He's much better. That's not only true, that's a huge truth. I choose the word better because it sums up all that I'm trying to say in this message. Not only is God far beyond us, much vaster than our puny minds can conceive, he's much better than we've ever imagined. God's ways are better. God's heart is better. God's thoughts are better. God's plan is better. All that God is and all that God does is better, and because that is true, we shouldn't be surprised that we continually run into the problem of not understanding him. And it shouldn't surprise us when his questions don't always line up, or when his answers to our questions don't always line up with our desire. What do you do when you've prayed and you don't like the answer you received? That happens to all of us sooner or later. Whenever I mention this in a sermon, heads nod in instant agreement. What do you do when you don't like God's answer? You can try bargaining, but it's not going to work. You can be angry, but that's not going to help. You can ask God some questions, which is what Habakkuk did. You can go back to the first principles, the basic principles of what we believe about God, and remind yourself who God is. That's also what Habakkuk did. Most of all, you can decide to wait on the Lord in faith and hope and in confidence that what doesn't make sense now will make sense later. As you wait, remember that God doesn't keep time the way you do. A.W. Tozer said, God never hurries. There are no deadlines against which he must work. He doesn't wear a wristwatch, doesn't have a calendar on his wall. For the moment, we're going to leave Habakkuk right there. He's in his little tower, he's looking and he's watching and he's waiting for the Lord to give him an answer. Waiting is good for the soul, especially if you're waiting upon the Lord. As you wait, remember that God has not forgotten you. You're on his mind right now. He sees you in your confusion and in your fear and your distress. Do not despair. But as you wait, rest your weary soul on this mighty promise from God. Isaiah 40:31 says, They who wait upon the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings like eagles. They shall run and not grow weary. They shall walk and not faint. Well, we'll leave Habakkuk right there in his little watchtower, waiting and waiting upon the Lord. And we'll pick this up again next Sunday as we continue in our series in the book of Habakkuk. God bless. Have a wonderful week. And let's continue to exchange prayers daily.